This is ATV World. Stay with us as we take a retrospective look at the news and events that shaped our world on 2001, War and Fear.
Hello and welcome to our special program covering the events that shaped the year. A series of terrorist attacks devastated the United States and shook the world in September, dominating headlines for the rest of the year. More than 3,000 people died when hijacked planes slammed into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. It was the first direct attack on the American mainland in more than a century and a complete shock for millions who had felt safe within the borders of the world's only superpower. Nothing could have prepared the American people for the horrifying events of September 11th. An American Airlines plane carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew members slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. New York time, just as thousands of people were arriving for work. The impact opened a huge hole near the top of the 110-story block, setting off a fire that soon consumed the upper section. Just 15 minutes later, as live footage of the crash was being broadcast to viewers worldwide, a United Airlines passenger jet with 64 people on board plowed into the South Tower, causing a massive explosion. The planes had been hijacked at the start of their journeys, which meant they were fully loaded with fuel, part of a plan to cause the maximum possible explosion. Half an hour after the second crash, another American Airlines jet carrying 58 passengers and 6 crew members slammed into the Pentagon in Washington, causing a portion of the 5-sided structure to collapse. It was an attack on the heart of the American military machine, an impregnable fortress that had remained unmolested even during the Cold War. A fourth plane, a United Airlines passenger jet with 45 people on board, crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, amid speculation that a struggle on board caused it to go out of control, away from its target, which could have been the White House or the President's Camp David retreat. While the world watched horrified, there was more devastation to come. The impact of the two planes slamming into the Trade Center caused both towers to collapse one after another, taking down thousands still trapped inside in a shower of debris and thick dust that soon obliterated the Manhattan skyline. The intense fire, fed by thousands of liters of jet fuel on board the two aircraft, weakened the steel supports of the buildings, causing the walls to buckle and the top floors to give way, leading to the collapse of the entire buildings. The entire central Manhattan area had to be evacuated as more than 10,000 rescue workers were deployed. The first wave of emergency personnel rushed into the burning buildings before they collapsed, never to come out again. A third 47-story building close to the Trade Center also collapsed. The attacks were compared to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but the death toll was far higher.
The estimate would be for both of the buildings that although building number 2 had a chance to clear out, a lot of people probably cleared out of building number 2. Building number 1 had some time to clear out, but there were areas of it that were affected. The best estimate that we can make, relying on the Port Authority and just everyone else that has experience with this, is that there'll be a few thousand people left in each building.
Panic swept across the U.S., plunging the country into a virtual state of war. For the first time in American aviation history, all commercial flights nationwide were grounded. The White House and all government buildings, as well as the Capitol in Washington, were evacuated. U.S. President George W. Bush was rushed to one secret location after another, while warplanes and battleships were deployed in fear of further attacks. The hijackers were unknown men, armed only with box cutters and a steely determination to destroy the citadels of American financial power and military might. They did not leave behind suicide letters or videotaped statements explaining or glorifying their acts. But in just 3 hours, they had managed to hijack 4 airliners and use them to reduce the country's 2 most important cities to war zones of carnage and fear. What they had carried out were calculated acts of terror, managed with a skill not seen before. They had apparently succeeded in penetrating the security systems at several airports and then placed trained pilots on board the doomed flights to complete the job. Evidence would emerge later that they had learned to pilot aircraft at aviation schools in the US. Addressing the nation hours later, the US president said the attacks were acts of war, but hastened to assure the American public that the government was still in control and ready to strike back.
Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
One of the first international leaders to condemn the attacks and express condolences was Palestinian President Yasser Arafat, realizing that this was a devastating blow to the Palestinian cause. Mr. Arafat distanced himself from the hijackers and what cause they might have had, fearing that Israel would take advantage of the situation to play international sentiments against the Palestinians by linking them to Islamic terrorists. Mr. Arafat joined other Palestinians in giving blood for the relief effort in New York. As condolences poured in from around the world, the United Nations Secretary General appealed for reason.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated, and as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever. We do not know yet who is behind these acts or what objective they hope to achieve. What we do know is that no just cause can be advanced by terror.
There were stronger reactions from the European Union and NATO, which for the first time in its 52-year history invoked an article declaring that the atrocities were attacks against all of the alliance's 19 member states.
The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. The commitment to collective self-defense embodied in the Washington Treaty was first entered into in circumstances very different from those that exist now, but it remains no less valid and no less essential today in a world subject to the scourge of international terrorism.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair said the attacks had been directed against his country as well, given that hundreds of British citizens were killed, and spoke of London's obligation to help bring those responsible to justice.
The world now knows the full evil and capability of international terrorism, which menaces the whole of the democratic world. These terrorists responsible have no sense of humanity, of mercy, or of justice. To commit acts of this nature requires a fanaticism and a wickedness beyond our normal contemplation.
Over the coming days, thousands of disaster workers searched for survivors among the rubble of the Trade Center, now called Ground Zero. Aided by sniffer dogs, bulldozers and spotlights, New York firefighters and police worked round the clock trying to find signs of life under tons of twisted steel and concrete. The disaster seemed to bring out the best among the people of New York, with firefighters and policemen showing courage and grace during rescue work, while the city's population cheered them on. But it also brought out the worst as the days wore on. On one occasion, New York firefighters clashed with police when Mayor Giuliani decided to cut down the number of personnel on rescue duty. The firefighters said they did not want to rest until the last bodies were brought out of the rubble, amid accusations that the real issue was the loss of lucrative overtime payments when they were pulled off the ground zero shift. And there was more controversy when a wealthy Saudi prince donated $10 million to the relief fund after touring ground zero. While he expressed horror over the carnage and condemned terrorism, his call for the U.S. to be more even-handed when dealing with the Middle East crisis upset Mayor Giuliani, who returned the check. A week after the tragedies, candlelight vigils and memorials were held across New York and Washington, along with the first funerals for the victims. Americans were not alone in their grief, as people across the world also paid their respects to those who died, with memorials, prayer services, and moments of silence. We'll be back after the break with the fallout of the terror attacks, including the war in Afghanistan. Stay with us.
Just what the busy mariner needs. An extra pair of hands. The Rolex Yachtmaster.
Cartoon Christmas is coming to Dragon Center.
It's party time!
Your chance to party with the Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, Dexter, and Dee Dee. Win great prizes on the lucky draw. So you better watch out, you better not cry, and you better call the hotline for details, 2535-2838. Merry Christmas.
In my own personal experience in Texas, I had a gun pulled on me. So in the scene, I had a suggestion for the director.
You arrested my husband.
Wait!
Mrs. Hendler? Nick, don't move.
They are investigators of CSI. Coming on January 7th.
我個仔好乖㗎，一放學就返屋企。返嚟啦？係啊，佢日日都即刻入房做功課，做完先玩一陣電腦。
你知啦，電腦嘅嘢我哋唔熟，都想去識多啲㗎。阿 Sir， 我以為佢返咗屋企就得㗎啦，我都唔知佢用電腦都可以犯罪嘅。
Watch out for computer crime.
Players and their game, highlights and recaps, news and happenings, on the court, behind the scenes. It's the ultimate courtside perspective on NBA Action, every Sunday evening at 6:30.
我職位高，壓力大，收入高，應酬多，血脂高，危險啊！膽固醇升高，甘油三酯升高，漢林牌青脂膠囊每天清一清，血脂不再高，漢林牌青脂膠囊。
The terror attacks on the United States triggered a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences, financial and political, in every corner of the globe. Washington declared war on terrorism and pulled the rest of the world in, saying there was no neutral ground. The campaign against terror began with a war in Afghanistan. Soon after the terror attacks on New York and Washington, the U.S. blamed this man, Osama bin Laden, a Saudi tycoon living in exile in Afghanistan. Washington said bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network had planned and carried out the attacks, and Afghanistan's Taliban rulers were sponsoring terrorism by giving bin Laden and his followers shelter. Bin Laden, himself a creation of American opposition to Soviet rule in Afghanistan, became Washington's public enemy #1 after he was accused of masterminding the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Over the next few weeks, Washington began heading down the road to vengeance. The US built up an international coalition to support its efforts to hit back its allies, including governments with shady human rights records. The US also began massing troops and military firepower within striking distance of Afghanistan. But the campaign against terror took off on a controversial note when Washington decided to call the mission Operation Infinite Justice. The name had to be changed quickly to Operation Enduring Freedom to avoid offending Muslim allies who pointed out that only Allah could deliver infinite justice. Repeated warnings were issued to Taliban leaders that they would face the consequences if they did not hand over bin Laden and close all al-Qaeda training camps in the country. The Taliban was defiant at first, given that the militia's supreme ruler, Mullah Muhammad Omar, was a close friend of bin Laden. Taliban officials softened their tone later on, expressing a willingness to surrender the fugitive if they were shown proof of his involvement. But the US refused to negotiate or make public any concrete evidence. It was only towards the end of the year that Washington released a grainy, muffled amateur videotape of what it claimed was bin Laden proving beyond doubt that he was guilty. The tape appeared to show bin Laden discussing the terror attacks in chilling detail and actually naming some of the hijackers. On October 7th, Washington launched a fierce wave of attacks on Afghanistan. The strike was announced by US President George W. Bush, who described it as the first war of the 21st century.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain. Every nation has a choice to make. In this conflict, there is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves. And they will take that lonely path at their own peril.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair also addressed his nation to justify the attacks, despite significant opposition among his people to any war.
No country lightly commits forces to military action and the inevitable risks involved. But we made it clear, following the attacks upon the United States on September the 11th, that we would take part in action once it was clear who was responsible. There is no doubt in my mind, nor in the mind of anyone who has been through all the available evidence, including intelligence material, that these attacks were carried out by the al-Qaeda network masterminded by Osama bin Laden. Equally, it is clear that his network is harbored and supported by the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan.
As in the Gulf War, viewers around the world were treated to the Pentagon's video footage of so-called smart bombs destroying targets with pinpoint precision. The targets were Taliban military installations and al-Qaeda camps, destroyed with some accuracy. But many of the casualties were civilians, as bombs and missiles started going astray, even destroying UN warehouses filled with food and medical supplies. The killing and maiming of innocent Afghan people, including women and children, were described as collateral damage by the Pentagon, which issued no apologies. American planes also dropped food packets for Afghan civilians, but there were some casualties when people began wandering into minefields to pick up the packages, and many mistook brightly colored cluster bomb canisters for food drops. And all the while, there were warnings across the world that the war was triggering a massive refugee crisis, with millions of Afghans fleeing their homes and trying to escape into neighboring countries. The US bombed the Taliban, while opposition Afghan forces under the banner of the Northern Alliance did the groundwork. Alliance fighters, notorious in the past for their human rights abuses, became Washington's friends and overnight champions of democracy as they fought against the Taliban with new momentum. And backed by the world's most powerful air force, they soon had the Taliban on the run. The first nail in the Taliban coffin was the fall of the key northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif in November. This was followed by a massacre at a fortress outside the city when alliance fighters backed by US warplanes and special forces came down hard on Taliban prisoners who staged an uprising. Among those killed were hundreds of Pakistani, Arab and Chechen Taliban volunteers. The next stunning gain for the alliance was the capital Kabul, which the Taliban deserted overnight without a fight. Alliance fighters swept into Kabul, ignoring calls from their American mentors to keep out because of concerns about the fate of the civilian population. The people of Kabul spilled out onto the streets to celebrate their newfound freedom after years under the repressive rule of the Taliban. The northern city of Kunduz was the next to fall, Taliban fighters deserting it in truckloads. The end of Taliban rule in Afghanistan came with the surrender of the militia's southern spiritual stronghold of Kandahar. But the US had to taste victory mixed with some bitterness when Mullah Omar disappeared amid the confusion. Against a backdrop of power struggles between various factions of the alliance, as well as among tribal chiefs, the UN managed to set up an interim government for Afghanistan under Hamid Karzai.
At least the war against terrorism and the Taliban has finished in the mainstream of things. But we'll have to look for their hideouts. We'll have to finish them completely in Afghanistan, and we are very serious about that. The same way that the Taliban did not represent Afghans, the same way that they did not represent Afghan values or history, exactly in the same way terrorism in no way represents anything in Islam.
The focus then shifted to the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding in a cave complex, along with hundreds of die-hard followers. The final chapter of the Afghan war saw intense bombing raids on the Tora Bora region, along with a ground offensive by Afghan militia to flush out al-Qaeda fighters. But when the last caves were overrun, there was no trace of bin Laden, only rumors that he may have fled across the border to Pakistan.
There has been information that has been gathered in Afghanistan that has directly resulted in the arrest of people across the world, in other side of the globe, and undoubtedly have prevented other terrorist activities. So it's a very worthwhile thing to be doing.
While the war in Afghanistan had far-reaching consequences worldwide, another major fallout of the September attacks felt across the globe was the economic one. A week after the attacks, Wall Street reopened amid fears that a paralyzed New York could drive the US economy into recession. Share prices plunged, despite predictions of a patriotic rally, and the US Federal Reserve as well as the European Central Bank were forced to cut interest rates. With the insurance bill from the terror attacks estimated to reach a staggering $70 billion, airlines began cutting down their fleet sizes and sacking workers in their thousands. The US Congress approved a $15 billion bailout package for airline companies, but critics alleged that the only ones who benefited were the shareholders, while jobless workers were left high and dry. While the war was still raging in Afghanistan, the US came under the grip of an anthrax scare in October. It began with contaminated mail sent to a newspaper office in Florida and quickly spread across the country and then on to the rest of the world. At one stage, nearly 30 people tested positive for exposure to the deadly bacteria at the Washington office of Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. At least 5 people died, while more than a dozen were infected.
Anytime someone sends anthrax through the mail, in my judgment, it's a terrorist act. You don't send anthrax through the mail without the kind of intent and conduct that's, I think, fairly labeled as terrorism. And so we believe these to be terrorist acts. We are not able to rule out an association with the terrorist acts of September the 11th. But neither are we able to draw a conclusive link at this time in that respect.
The media whipped up a frenzy about bioterrorism by bin Laden's followers through the US Postal Service, but official investigations indicated that the source could be closer to home. The anthrax spores found in letters are believed to have been produced in the US. We'll be back after the break with a look back at the global political scene. Stay with us.
I always dream of you. My love, Samsung.